It finally happened. Earlier today, Xbox gave us an update and clear look at the future of Xbox. Some of their exclusives are going to other platforms, but also some confirmation on what games won't be going to other platforms. And we even got a pretty interesting tease on the next Xbox console, as well as a new console that may be coming out later this year. If you haven't been following this news, last week the death of Xbox was announced. Xbox Hour came out with an exclusive leak that Starfield was going to be coming to PlayStation 5. And further reports from insiders even seem to back this up, with more games potentially coming to PlayStation and Nintendo Switch as well. So of course, this led to community disarray, but thankfully today we got some answers, as several top Xbox executives sat down to explain what was actually going on with this company during their recent podcast. If you followed all of that leak news, what was going on there, almost all of that was wrong or just outright overblown, at least for now. What's actually going on is this.
So we made the decision that we're going to take 4 games to the other consoles, just 4 games, not a change to our kind of fundamental exclusive strategy. We're making these decisions for some specific reasons.
So of course, the immediate next question you'll probably have is, well, which games are going over? And sadly, they don't actually tell us.
I'm not going to name those games. The teams that are building those games have announced plans that are not too far away. As we know, game teams put a lot of energy into their announcements with the partners. So
I honestly found this to be kind of weird. Thankfully, we do get the very important clarification that neither Starfield nor Indiana Jones are going to other platforms, at least for right now. Those 2 games will remain Xbox exclusives. But later on in this video, I'll explain why I don't actually think that's going to last, and I could see this being a larger shift at Xbox. And when it comes to not announcing the 4 games, while I do understand that respecting developers' own opportunity for reveals is important, the entire point of this podcast was to clear up misinformation. I feel like just naming the games would have been worth it rather than leading to more speculation by the fans and communities. Although they basically confirm which games are going over, they describe how these are games that are over a year old and they feel have largely reached their full potential on Xbox, community-driven games that will now have access to a new community on those other platforms for further growth, and how 2 games are smaller titles that were never intended to be system sellers anyway, just fun projects from specific studios. So from Xbox's perspective, bringing games like this over to other platforms is not damaging their business at all, but instead it's just giving an opportunity for the communities around those games to grow even further, because they feel these games are pretty well saturated on Xbox already. On the Xbox side, it seems like Hi-Fi Rush is effectively confirmed to be going over to PlayStation and the Nintendo Switch. We could largely confirm this thanks to some of the existing data mines. And Tom Warren from The Verge reports that the other 3 games going over are Pentiment, Sea of Thieves, and Grounded. Tom Warren was able to actually talk to Phil Spencer ahead of this news going live, and he further clarifies that at first it'll just be Hi-Fi Rush and Pentiment, with Sea of Thieves and Grounded coming a bit later. And yeah, I think this all makes a lot of sense. If you keep up with Xbox and watch their events enough, you've seen all of these games. You've had numerous opportunities to play Grounded and Sea of Thieves already. I mean, it literally pops up at basically every single Xbox show. I can't imagine there's many people in the Xbox community who are unaware of these titles, and considering so many people have Game Pass, they likely have reached a point where they're just not seeing that many new players anymore. They're relatively small but fun games that don't have a ton going on right now, so expanding them to a totally new audience to potentially generate a couple extra million does make sense. But to me, the games themselves are one of the least interesting parts about this overall presentation, and I think the reasoning as to why they're bringing these games over is far more interesting and far more telling, as I really doubt that these are the only games going over to PlayStation and the Nintendo Switch. During this podcast, they consistently reiterate the line about growing games and ensuring the long-term health of Xbox. And Phil Spencer further clarified that he believes exclusive games in general are on the way out.
Exclusive games that are exclusive to one piece of hardware, are going to be a smaller and smaller part of the game industry.
So on one hand, perhaps Xbox just views exclusives as a dying breed of games, and they're trying to get a bit ahead of the curve by testing things out now when they think this is the direction the entire industry is going. But to me, what I found to be the most telling quote from this entire presentation was this.
4 games, no promise beyond that. So if you're on those other platforms and you see these 4 games coming, please don't take it as some signal that everything's coming. It's not. And we're going to learn.
I think this is the real explanation of what's going on. Something isn't going right at Xbox right now, at least in my opinion, and I think there's quite a few signs pointing towards that. I don't think releasing your exclusives on other platforms is sign of health from a company. If they were rolling in cash, they probably just wouldn't bother, because they're probably not going to make a ton of money from these games on PlayStation and the Nintendo Switch. And I wouldn't be shocked if somebody at Microsoft was like, whoa, you're spending a ton of money on acquisitions and these Game Pass numbers aren't quite as high as we had hoped. So now this, bringing their games to other platforms, is their attempt at a solution, and one that just kind of works. They're bringing some of their smaller but still fun titles to other platforms just to see how much of a success it is, how much more money they could start making by some of these releases, hence that comment from Phil Spencer about how they're going to learn from this. If this ends up being a large success, like let's say they see a 30 to 40% increase in players for Pentiment, we could very easily model that for some of your other and larger games that will actually start adding in some serious revenue for Microsoft overall. So I very much so think that if this ends up being a large success, it'll be a strategy they will employ more and more in the future, and very likely could reach a point where larger game releases on other platforms start to happen. We could see them switch to a timed exclusivity instead of just a full-on exclusivity. And as you do broaden the context, I think the writing was on the wall that something like this was bound to happen, particularly on the Game Pass side. We've seen the quotes about how Microsoft might exit the game business if it does not see progress in Xbox Game Pass subscribers by 2027. That made the rounds a lot last year and even a bit before then. And from this leaked document that we only got a few months ago, we could see that Microsoft/Xbox projected to have over 40 million Game Pass subscribers by 2023. During this most recent podcast, it was revealed that there are currently 34 million Game Pass subscribers right now. And even that's an artificially inflated number because it includes the cheaper Game Pass Core that was previously labeled as Xbox Live Gold, but they recently switched it to Game Pass Core. So potentially a good chunk of that 34 million is not even paying a full $10 a month and instead actually in a much lower tier, well below the 40 million target and even further below it when you account for the Game Pass Core subs. I honestly think this is just a simple case of their original plan isn't paying the bills, so they're trying something else to help that out. Phil Spencer does reiterate that there's no fundamental change to how they think about exclusivity, but I think that's just for right now. The games didn't come out on other platforms yet, so of course they didn't change their plans yet. They don't have the data yet, but if they make enough money on some of those PlayStation or Nintendo Switch releases, I could see things start to change relatively rapidly. And even when it does come to something like Starfield, it seems like paid mods are really their long-term play. So eventually it's going to come a time where there's no more official DLCs coming out, and instead there'll just be a steady flow of paid mods coming to the game, and Microsoft and Xbox will collect that sweet microtransaction revenue. If that becomes the main source of revenue for the title, releasing it on some other platform does make a ton of sense because you're just going to make more of it. And the closer you look at Xbox, the more this starts to make sense. On the PlayStation side, exclusives really are a major selling point. There's a lot of fantastic games that you could only play on PlayStation, not even on PC for a lot of them. Over the past few years, in an attempt to catch up to the PlayStation sales numbers, Xbox has been adding other value adds. Game Pass makes playing on many of these games far cheaper, and just in general is a subscription service perhaps providing the most value out of any subscription service currently available. You get access to millions of hours of content just from that one subscription. During this podcast, they say that they know Game Pass will only be available on Xbox. I wouldn't be shocked if they tried to get it on other platforms like Steam or PlayStation and it just didn't work out. But if Game Pass is only on Xbox, that's a huge incentive to buy an Xbox and play. So even if the console exclusivity starts to just be a timed console exclusivity, I think the Game Pass aspect really is a nice X factor that Xbox has going for them here. As of right now, I very much so think we're just in the early stages of this. We'll likely see these games come over to the other platforms in the next few months, but it very likely will still be years after that while they process the data and interpret what's going on before we see other major moves. It could be years before some of the data is processed and any other decisions are made. But to me, one of the biggest takeaways here is something's not working at Xbox right now. They're doing this and trying something new for a reason. I don't think Xbox is about to close up shop or anything like that, but I have to imagine that if this doesn't work, they're going to try something else. Although, separate from almost all of that, we also got some really nice PR talk around hardware.
And we got more to come. There's some exciting stuff coming out in hardware that we're going to share this holiday, and we're also invested in the next generation roadmap. And what we're really focused on there is delivering the largest technical leap you will have ever seen in a hardware generation, which makes it better for players and better for creators and the visions that they're building.
So to me, this could actually be pretty interesting. It seems like something around hardware later this year is likely to be a handheld. Phil Spencer has been liking quite a few posts about handhelds. And of course, we just recently got a new PlayStation handheld, so to stay in competition with that, they might want to release something. But their plans for the next-gen Xbox are also quite large and could end up being exciting, but that's still several years away, so we don't really know. The biggest leap in tech ever is such an artificial and arbitrary statement that I wouldn't really base any hype off of it. I mean, Starfield had the biggest engine upgrade in Bethesda history, and well, we saw how that all turned out. But honestly, more so than anything else, one of the biggest takeaways from all of this is how much of a disaster it's been for Xbox. If they were truly only planning to bring a few smaller titles to other platforms, I am perplexed as to why they waited so long to respond to some of these leaks and rumors. Like yeah, as a giant company, you probably don't want to feel like you need to respond to some random spreading misinformation, but this news got really big, and I think it did do damage to the Xbox brand, even with their response today. I think there's quite a few people out there that maybe were considering investing more into Xbox, whether it be buying more games, buying an Xbox, or even just subscribing to Game Pass, that maybe have second thoughts now. Because even though right now, of course, Starfield nor Indiana Jones are going to PlayStation, we do see Xbox starting to change their plans and strategy, and I imagine there's a lot of people out there wondering how much that strategy will continue to change over the next few years. I don't really view this all as a good thing or a bad thing. I'm a predominantly PC player, but I do think it's informative. I feel like we just learned something about Xbox, and we're going to continue to learn more about this after we see some of these new games released on other platforms. And I think in general, even with this updated clarification, damage was done, to the point where it makes me wonder if the original plan was to bring some of their larger titles like Starfield over to other platforms, but they saw how large the backlash was and changed course. There's no real evidence of that. I just truly think it's bizarre to wait a week to respond and then the response to be so minor. Like, this really isn't that big of a deal. If Xbox just announced a couple of games are coming to Nintendo Switch and PlayStation, this would almost not even be a big story. It's only a story, or at least only a story on this scale, because of all of the backlash that was seemingly artificial from last week. Either way, those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear from you guys down below. How do you feel about this? Is this making you change your plans going forward with your Xbox? But if you do want to get excited for the future, check out this video where I show you some of the absolutely incredible remake mods on their way to Fallout 4.